today is going to address responding to tragedy. And so I wanted to now introduce Jennifer Barahona. Jennifer is a social worker, and she joined the Newtown-Sandy Hook Community Foundation as its executive director in September 2013. She also responded, and you saw Jennifer in the film earlier today. Allison Gilbert is an author and very thought-provoking and influential writer on grief and resilience. And she's authored Covering Catastrophe, Broadcast Journalist Report, September 11th, and also a book that she's going to talk about tomorrow when we have a panel on commemoration, Past, Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive. And then we also have Amy Nitza. And Amy is a Ph.D., and she's a director at the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. If any of you are working in the field, they have a terrific conference. We've gone the last couple of years. Is it in what month? April, okay. And she's a psychologist who specializes in disaster mental health and group counseling, trained in international context. And Amy's going to be talking about her work in Haiti. And then we also have, and I'm sorry, let me just find it here, Danny Stebbins. And he's was a former colonel with the Connecticut State Police. And Dan is, he worked for 40 years of combined law enforcement experience, having worked in both the state and federal levels. And he responded to the shootings in Newtown. So I want to welcome the panelists, and we'll start with you then, Jennifer.
Thanks, Mary. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I really do feel like I've come full circle. I met Mary 16 years ago, shortly after September 11th. I was on the FEMA team that was contracted in Connecticut to work with those who had lost loved ones. So I had worked with those victims in my hometown of Darien, Connecticut, and so to be back here 16 years later is emotional in many ways. So thank you. As Mary mentioned, I have been in my role at the Newtown-Sandy Hook Community Foundation for 4 years as its first executive director. The Newtown-Sandy Hook Community Foundation is the big fund that was created after 1214. Some over $13 million raised by the United Way and the Newtown Savings Bank, which was incorporated into its own 501c3 to decide how the money should best be spent. So I came in 9 months later after they had gone through the first wave of distribution in a victim compensation way to those most impacted by the tragedy. And my former colleague in Newtown, Deb Scully, spoke a little bit this morning. So I don't want to repeat too much. And both of us, I think, are just going to brush over. All of you know what happened on that horrific day, but I do think it's important to provide a little bit of context. I think David just said when we have these community traumas, there's so much that's similar, but there's also a lot that's different, and I know Amy's going to speak on some of those differences culturally. Well, in terms of the culture of Newtown, unlike a 9/11 where you had victims from all over the world, this was a very small town that had experienced one homicide in the 10 years preceding the shootings, and who suddenly very quickly lost 26, 27, or 28 members of the community, and that in and of itself is a controversial number. But there were 28 people who died on that morning, and so there was pretty much nobody of the 28,000 people in town that weren't untouched in some way, that didn't know somebody. Deb spoke about that ripple impact, and I'll speak about that a little bit too. Similar numbers that Deb already covered, I won't go into, but I think the ripple is what still astounds me to this day, calls I get all the time from people that you just wouldn't think of necessarily. A funeral director who is now on disability, completely disabled because of his trauma from preparing so many of the children, the babysitter, the next door neighbor to, the shooter and his mother, or the kids who have gone away to college thinking they'd be okay, and 6 months later, they're not. They don't say they're from Newtown. They can't, when they're ordering from Amazon, give a zip code because suddenly it's, oh, you're from Newtown. It just doesn't end for the community. So many ripple impacts. We found this slide very helpful to us initially, and I think one thing that I'm reminded of is early on, we all thought, well, or the Newtown community thought, that's not going to be us. We're going to be different. We're a strong community, and they are, but it was not without its ups and downs. And this Zunin and Myers slide is really kind of based on a 3-year window. What we're struggling with is finding that timeline to be much longer. We're still very much in that coming to terms with a lot of dips along the way. Opening of the new Sandy Hook School, for instance, last year was very difficult. We have the 5-year anniversary coming up. We have a lot of leadership changes happening in the town, leaders that were there at the time that won't be there any longer. So we're still very much in that up and down coming to terms. I am going to pop over these challenges and triggering events because I don't think it's as important. You're all very familiar with memorials and disagreements and victims on every spectrum and everywhere in between. One of the most striking things I told some of my colleagues at lunch was, I had a victim family who said every resource, every dime should go exclusively to us and no one else. And I've also had a victim who said, my child is dead, there's nothing you can do for them, but I want you to make her surviving classmates as whole as humanly possible. They should get every resource that's available to them. And you have everything in between, of course. So the previous slide that showed the kind of bottoming out, we really did experience that. This is 2 years post-tragedy in 2015, and this was, I'm sorry, it's really hard to read, but this is a community survey that our foundation has been doing for the last several years. David referenced it in the brain spotting training that showed the efficacy there of brain spotting in the community. Well, this was showing anxiety, stress, anger, fear, excessive worry, and you can really see that went, it's really hard to read, I'm sorry, but that was almost out of 1,000 responders in 2015, nearly 80% of them were saying that they had excessive amounts of this in the community. So that very much, told us that first year or two of fog and grief and shock started to fall away. That's when we saw some of these issues becoming very present, and that's corroborated by some of the data we have on the funds that one of the largest parts of what we fund is the out-of-pocket costs for trauma treatment for those in the school, whether they were an emergency responder, a staff member, a surviving child, or a victim family member. So we've just hit the $2 million mark in what we have paid out for out-of-pocket costs. And that doesn't include a lot of the funds that we also provide for grants. For instance, when Deb was in her role, we provided grant funding so she could bring the trauma therapist she talked about, Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, in, to the Resiliency Center to bring David Grand in, to Catherine Shear's group. We've brought Center for Complicated Grief treatment directly into the community so we could train our clinicians inside the community directly. So just a little bit on some of what worked, some of what didn't, lessons learned along the way. For us, overseeing the largest fund is, of course, extraordinarily controversial. But what worked really well for us is establishing a distribution committee that makes all the decisions. I always say I don't have any decision-making authority. I certainly influence and am the one in the community making the relationships, but we have a committee made up of 10 individuals, including a victim family, a surviving advocate from the surviving witness children, parents from kids in the school. We have the chief of police. We have fire commissioner represented, clergy, Sandy Hook teacher. So this is a committee that meets and makes all these decisions for what are we hearing back from the community and where do we need to put our resources. So that's critically important, as was and is the collaboration with other funders. When I came to Newtown, there was one of my first what I thought was, well, I need to get in touch with who else has money, what are they doing with it, I don't want to duplicate. And I was given a list by the Attorney General's office that probably had 65, 70 different groups on it who had collected funds after Sandy Hook. So one of the things that I helped organize in those early, just particularly for the first 18 months after I got there, was a collaborative funding network where, the Lions, the Rotary, the Memorial Fund, the Sandy Hook Promise, all the groups that had funds, we started meeting regularly and saying, where does it make sense for us to work in partnership? So we actually now funnel the funds, and have since 2014, through our foundation, so that the Lions doesn't have their own process, and the Rotary, and people aren't running all over town trying to get resources. It became very streamlined, which was one of the best things I think that we did that came out. We also established really clear criteria and protocols, and it was tricky because we had to, I remember vividly meetings with groups like the Rotary and the Lions, who were run by businessmen and attorneys in town and CPAs. They have no idea what the mental health and trauma response needs of the community were. So that was an interesting dance. And I would say, but listen, things like yoga are incredibly important, expressive art therapies, animal-assisted therapies. So we definitely had to work to educate those who had funds to understand what was really going to be helpful. Certainly holding on to, we were criticized initially, and maybe still are, for holding on to some of the funds and not just giving it out right away. But I got a letter 2 weeks ago from a gentleman that said we would have been financially bankrupt with my daughter's inpatient treatment costs if you didn't have the funds available now to us. So we do have a sunset plan, which matches up with when the kindergartners from Sandy Hook will graduate high school. So we will be closing the foundation and spending down the resources in 2025. So it's really, for us, it's building up the capacity of the town to be able to take and carry this for the long term. So what didn't work as well were the so many funds that were developed, and then the sustainability and having people knowledgeable in trauma who were applying for the federal grants that were available. For instance, the team that Deb was on, that she mentioned earlier this morning, did fantastic work. We worked really closely. In fact, they did the care navigation and case management with families, and we kind of paid the bills, and we had this harmonious relationship. But that took, about 2 years post-tragedy, a year and a half post-tragedy to get that up and running, because there was an executive writing the grant that had no trauma experience, and it was just a lot of moving parts. And then there was no sustainability plan built in. So it was a great team. They got up and running. They were well-known, they were well-established, and then the grant ended, and it was, now what? And there was a new grant opportunity, but, salaries didn't match up and different opportunities, and it just was very unfortunate that we had something in place, and then it was replaced by something else, because as some of the people have spoken about before, obviously with the traumatized brain, it's hard enough to keep up with the information and the relationships and to figure out what's going on, but when you have groups coming and going and the names are almost the same. We had a resiliency center, and then we had a recovery and resiliency team. There were 2 different organizations, and people would call the wrong ones all the time. So there was a lot of confusion created there. We also have found really poor data collection exists to this day, so that we're having to push people to make data-driven decisions. You're going to pull a staff member out of Sandy Hook school. I want to see the evidence behind that. Is it the number of visits has precipitously dropped over the last year or 2? Why is that? Because right now it's very much we think we're approaching the 5 years, and it's probably time to scale back. So really having to push those conversations on that's not a good enough answer. We need to see data behind why you're doing some of these things. In terms of victims, survivors, emergency responders, I'm guessing Dan's going to talk about the wonderful one-on-one that they created with the Connecticut State Police and the victims right afterwards, and that was wonderful. The unfortunate part was that there wasn't anything that really picked that up in any real systematic way until a year ago. There was a specific victim advocate appointed. There had been one in the school system for surviving siblings, but there wasn't a counterpart kind of on the community side. So through a VOCA grant to the town, there is a designated victim advocate now, but that just took way too long to get going. I mentioned already the creation of the Resiliency and Recovery Team, which was a fantastic resource to link people up, but again, the delays in getting it started, and then the lack of thinking through to sustain that model after the initial grant period. David spoke about the Resiliency Center. That was a wonderful organization that exists to this day that really went beyond the traditional mental health. And we found so much that clinicians, all they knew about was CBT. I think there's an enormous, I think my colleagues would agree, deficit in knowledge of trauma that needs to be happening at schools of social work and all the professional mental health degrees to really have people understand better about trauma and the brain. So there was some good mental health organizations in town that existed, but there was a lot that wasn't there that we know is so helpful, such as brain spotting and EMDR. So the Resiliency Center has been really a tremendous asset to the community. One of the other things that I heard a lot of themes on earlier today was this idea of connections. One thing that we did, I've heard a lot about the importance of relations in a therapeutic setting. The same is true at a macro level. So having groups work with each other on a common issue. We established what was called community connections, where my organization, several others, got together to do programming. And we've had people that say one of the best things we ever did was to bring in people from other tragedy communities, Virginia Tech and Columbine and the Nickel Mines Amish community, to come and be with, victim to victim, survivor to survivor, emergency responder to emergency responder. And people say to this day that that was one of the most helpful things that we did, because it was really that idea of a shared experience. So we're still doing those community connections type events. And then finally, and I'll wrap up with this, is the clinical community, as I mentioned, being underprepared. And in our survey, in fact, 50% of them said that they felt underprepared to deal with what was coming their way. We had a lot of people come in who responded, the secondary responders, as David said, and but they were only there short term, the crisis kind of system, but they weren't all necessarily equipped. We've had quote-unquote experts who have come in that have probably caused more damage than they have helped. I'm seeing someone who worked in the community nodding. So that's very problematic, but bringing in the resources. It wasn't, when I called Catherine Shearer and talked about the grief model, there was not one person in the entire state of Connecticut trained to deliver the complicated grief model. So rather than expecting clinicians to be going into the city, which is hard, we just brought the training out to Newtown, and we trained 50 clinicians in the first round of CGT, and in April we did the 2-day second part with another 22 clinicians who are now more focused on that. So we've been doing that with brain spotting as well, and some of the other modalities, and then as well as the trauma fatigue, as Deb already mentioned. So I would just, maybe in closing say that, the relationships at the macro level, because that's my focus, it's always been my background, is just as important as it is at the micro client level. We have to be doing a better job of partnering, understanding. Mary and I talk about this a lot. There's so many wonderful resources out there, but we don't necessarily know each other exist. So the relationship building has to be done at that level as well. So. Oh, sure. The address for the foundation, which is www.n as in Newtown, S as in Sandy, H as in Hook, CF, communityfoundation.org. That's nshcf.org. And my email address is jbarahona, that's J-B as in boy, A-R-A-H-O-N as in Nancy, A, at nshcf.org. And the reports that we do an annual report on how the community is doing, and David referenced that in his slides. That's public on our website, so you're welcome to take a look at that and anything else we have. My contact information is on the website too, so please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Allison Gilbert, and I just want to thank Mary again for putting this together and being such a dynamo. It's really impressive. My talk is going to be about an area we haven't addressed yet today, which is a white space that I think deserves some attention. The white space is between survivors and first responders, and I heard a term today about second responders. And you asked us to, raise our hands about how we self-identify. And it was striking to me that I didn't quite know where or when or if I should raise my hand, because I don't neatly fill either bucket. I'm a journalist, and I'll explain more of that experience as we go forward a little bit this afternoon together in the time that I have. But as a journalist, I certainly feel like a survivor. As a journalist, I also feel I was there as a first responder. But of course, I wasn't saving lives, so it feels different. So that's part of the struggle that I want to be able to illuminate today, which is by vocation, journalists are first responders, but of course get a little bit less, and perhaps they should, less sympathy because they've gone by choice. So where does that leave reporters, producers, editors, photographers, cameramen? I want to start by reading the introduction that I put together with some other journalists of this book that Mary mentioned, which is about how broadcasters covered 9/11. We didn't include print because our experience that we brought to the table was that we were television folks and we were radio folks. We weren't newspaper folks. So this will give you, these two little paragraphs will give you an idea, at least to begin, about where I come from. For nearly 2 weeks after the September 11th attacks, the Q-tips I used after every shower came out of my ears covered in gritty black dirt. It was a daily reminder that I had responded to and been part of the most horrific news story of my lifetime. In the days after the attacks, a friend advised me to write down everything that had happened to me. I did. I wrote about my fear of suffocating in an avalanche of debris. I wrote about being taken to the hospital and reporting on live television from my hospital bed. I wrote it all down, and it helped. And it also gave me the idea for this book. I wanted to offer other journalists the same opportunity to document their September 11th experiences and share their feelings about them. There are a couple of things I didn't include in that opening portion of my book. The friend wasn't a friend, it was a post-traumatic stress psychologist who I was seeing. The need to share stemmed from the fact that for many of us, we weren't war correspondents. We were, that day, as we'll talk about, was, mayoral primary day. That day was Fashion Week. So for many of those, reporters, they thrust themselves purposefully into a situation that they were solely ill-equipped to cover emotionally. So why was I there? And why was I so close and taken to Bellevue? I was a producer at WNBC TV, and my job was to go. When the first tower came down, I ducked into a store. The dust cloud passed by, and I just, okay, well, how could that happen again? I wasn't computing the magnitude of what was unfolding. So I kept going downtown, and when the second tower imploded, I was on West and Vesey Street, and was obviously way too close. And part of the arrogance of being a journalist with a press tag is that I was warned by many first responders to go back, don't come here, you're going too close, go away, go north, don't come here. And what a press pass allows me to do is basically ignore them, because I had a job to do. So that job landed me in Bellevue Hospital with tubes down my throat. Had a lot of trouble breathing. But the truth that you can't see in this triage tag that was put around my neck is that I desperately wanted to get on that ambulance that would take me away from downtown Manhattan. I was not a war correspondent. I did not want to be downtown. And there is a chance, a slight hope, a dream that I could have been pregnant that day. My husband and I were desperately trying to get pregnant because my father was dying of cancer. And so we were trying to outrun the gun so my dad would know that we were pregnant with his first, I was going to say second, my brother already had his kids, but my first child. So, not proud of it. I got on that ambulance because I said I was pregnant. I was terrified of being downtown. Did not want to be there any further. NBC, I had no cause to kind of keep that front and center at that point. I was terrified. P.S. I wasn't pregnant, but we got pregnant the next month, and my father died that Friday. So Tuesday was 9/11. My father did die that Friday. So the 9/11 experience was so stirring for me. I had so much trouble moving forward that I mentioned I saw a post-traumatic stress professional, which was really, really helpful. I did that on my own, not through NBC at the time, so I can talk about that too in terms of responding and how networks now respond very differently. But I'm the only female journalist inside the National September 11th Memorial Museum whose work is on display. So that triage tag that I just showed you, the blue sign to the left that explains who I was and what I was doing that day. Being a part of the museum for me is incredibly healing. It further gave reason for my work, that I was a part of something, I was reporting something, and it didn't just end after I did my work that day. I was on the air that afternoon on TV, and from my hospital bed, I did a phone interview. People were wondering, how were you on TV, but from the hospital bed? It gave me purpose. They couldn't tear me off the phone because I felt like if I was going to be here and witness such tragedy, there might have well be some upside. But I was having trouble emotionally. And so I reached out to a lot of my broadcast journalists' friends, people who worked across the New York area, so Channel 2, 4, 7, 9, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, just imagine where you would go. And we decided to fan out as quickly as possible to record the first-person experiences of those professionals before they had a chance. I will also say, in terms of poor behavior moving forward of journalists and many other people, about, they always knew it was terrorism, right? Like people kind of invented how they were so smart when they kind of knew what was happening. Or they would, talk about being closer to the unfolding events than they really were. We wanted to go in, get these first-person responses before the editing could happen about what they saw. What they saw on TV would later inform what they think they saw themselves. So we ended up reaching out to about 200 journalists Among them, all the people that you would see on TV that day. So Peter Jennings and Dan Brokaw and Aaron Brown at CNN. It was his first day on the job, and Ann Compton, who was on Air Force One that day, literally with the president, to get these first-person responses. So I wanted to share some of them that really reflect not the professional, because we kind of expect the professionalism in the reporting, but this duality that I think is under the radar. This duality of reporting and yet being concerned about what's happening in your own backyard. So for those who can't maybe see it in the back, so Ernie Anastas, we're all familiar with him, yes? Gotta love Ernie. I had seen so much pain, heartbreak, and fear that day and night, but we had to keep working. I found a moment to check my phone messages to see if my family was okay. John King, I'm sure you guys are familiar with him from CNN and all the political coverage. I try very hard in my work not to let things hit me personally, but I had a recurring sense of disbelief and a fear of how my children, 8 and 5, would process something like this. Barbara Starr, you're probably familiar with her on CNN. Her quote that I wanted to include is too long for the screen, but I do think it's on point, and if you'll indulge me, I'll just read it to you. She was a producer at the time in the Pentagon. I've been to Bosnia. I've been to the Persian Gulf. If you tell me I am going to cover a war, that's fine. I am prepared for what I'm going to see. I know it's going to be unpleasant. I know there are going to be people who are crying, emotion, death, disease, and stink. That's the cost of doing business when you want to cover the military. This was different because I did not enter this zone as a reporter coming to observe a battlefield. I was in the Pentagon when the plane hit. I didn't expect it. I could not do totally what reporters do, which is to take their notebook, put it in front of their face, and hide behind it as a dispassionate observer. I did my job. I did what was required of me. But I cannot deny that there was a separate track in my mind on which I was thinking, this story also happened to me. So I want to talk about the story also happening to reporters. I would argue that journalism shifted that day. There may have been examples of amazing events when Kennedy was shot and others, where reporters were allowed to emote, or maybe they weren't allowed to, it was just more permissible. But more times than not, there was this old school, journalists are dispassionate, journalists are, stoic, that there's this poker face, that you go into a place like Newtown or 9/11, and you parachute in, you get your quotes, and then you leave. But all the while, you're emoting because you want to get that quote, right? You're empathizing or you're sympathizing, but you're doing this because you have an objective. I mean, that's the dirty truth of journalism. You're trying to understand what's going on, create a connection with someone who's just been through a disaster, but eventually you're going to leave. 9/11 and going forward is different, because this was on your own turf, where your own children were in danger, or your spouses, or just friends. And so the amount of emotion when you go back and look at the tapes is incredibly shocking. And also, with that transparency, liberating, because journalists got to wear a different hat. It wasn't just reporter, you got to also have this human side that had the capacity of bringing you some measure of understanding from people who maybe got that attention being first responders or survivors. So I want to talk about the shift that happened to some journalists after covering this. A Channel 4 cameraman, they call them photogs, a cameraman, covered that day in his lens, seeing the horror unfolded, had his camera on the jumpers who died that day. And at some point, he had to turn the camera down because he couldn't do that work. He was traumatized by having to train his eye, and he turned the camera off. People were dying, and all I could do was document it. After that day, and the weeks and months later, this multi-year veteran who won numerous awards quit, moved to Colorado, where he still is, and now he's playing in the band, in a guitar band, and he's incredibly happy. But in terms of the motivation to leave a career, it was because this was unlike anything else. And then I have a quiz for the New Yorkers, of course, in the room. This is a cameraman, but who does he look like? Did you guys hear Mary? Does he kind of look like Chuck Scarborough? I'll go back. So that's Chuck's brother, Jeff. Jeff and I worked together because I was a Channel 4 producer, and I worked with Chuck too. And when I wanted to find out more about exactly what Jeff was up to now, I knew he had gone to Colorado, but I wanted to get the update for coming today. I emailed Chuck, and I said, Chuck, so what's happening with Jeff? Put us back in touch. I really want to see how he's doing, and he's doing really well playing the guitar. Part of my feeling of ownership of the journalism experience is because I've just given voice to it. It's not because my story is any better or worse than anyone else's, but this ability to write the book and kind of label that being a journalist is this unique category allowed the museum to reach out to me. Not only do I have that on display, but they have an audio tour when you go to the museum. And Robert De Niro introduced me and my voice as the experience when that antenna came down. A lot of broadcast journalists died that day. And all the proceeds from the book went to the families of those broadcast engineers who died. So I want to leave you just with a thought, because I know I'm probably running out of time, which is that as we talk about different modalities of treating victims, proper resources to offer survivors and their families and communities, we're not talking about equal, but there is an interesting white space where journalists have this pause of how much really should I voice? How much should I vent? What's appropriate? And really, what would be the feedback if I do? Because how can you compare? It's uncomfortable. It almost seems unseemly. But it's there nonetheless, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today. And one thing I wanted to leave you with is that at the time when I was at Channel 4 and I sought the post-traumatic stress resources, which were so helpful to me, now many, many news organizations have those resources in-house. And so the more and more these tragedies take place, as of course they've been increasing, the journalists who cover these events do have more and more access to the emotional support that they need to do their work. So thank you.
I'm the director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz, and what my personal professional interest is in cross-cultural application of this work. In addition to working in Haiti, I spent a year working in Botswana with victim survivors of the HIV/AIDS epidemic there. I spent a semester in Bhutan working at the National Hospital, where I was the only psychologist in the country when I was there. And then I have this work in Haiti that I've been doing. And so what I thought I would do today is pull together some brief thoughts from my lessons learned in those experiences, and how those can apply to the theme that we have going today, which none of us planned, but this theme about connections and how to connect. So what I'd like to talk about sort of at a macro level is how to connect across diversity, and offer you some brief things to think about there. Where's that? Okay. So I'm sure that a lot of you, if you do this work professionally, have seen this list before. So this is the sort of basis for disaster mental health work in early intervention. And these are what we know so far as the best practices in early intervention when responding to disaster or tragedy. And the two that I wanted to highlight, which again are themes that have come up across the day, is that two of the things we know empirically, in addition to all the experiences that you've all had personally, what we know empirically is the importance of connectedness and social support, and the importance of not only self-efficacy, but collective efficacy or community efficacy. And in this time when we're living in diverse communities and there's so much that divides us, how can we connect across those divides? And if you think about the different information that we've had today about the brain and how the brain responds to trauma, those are the times when it might be the hardest for us to think outside of our own box and look across the divide, but yet it's some of the most important things that we can do. So when I teach this at the graduate level to mental health clinicians in training, I start with this quote. So this is how I approach this work. This was written by Edward T. Hall in, I believe, 1904, but I think it applies today just as much as it does, as it did in 1904. Culture hides much more than it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Years of study have convinced me that the real job is not to understand foreign cultures, but to understand our own. And so when we hear this term of cultural competence, which is a term I don't quite understand, I don't know what culture we're talking about that we're going to be competent in, but so my argument is that the culture we need to be competent in is our own, and to understand the hidden assumptions that are implicit in the work that we do. And my argument to you is that if we can understand the hidden assumptions that are implicit in our own work, then we can check those assumptions at the door when we work with people who are different than us. So I'd like to, a term I heard recently, I didn't come up with it, some of my colleagues at the University of Buffalo are the ones who introduced it to me, but instead of cultural competence, they used the term cultural humility. And I like that a lot better. That's, I think, what we're looking for. So I've pulled together some questions that I think apply to this topic in terms of thinking of diversity in relation to tragedy from a couple different others who do this work. And if you look at this list, I'd like to sort of shrink it down into three categories, and those are about how people make meaning of what's happening to them, what attributions they make about what's happening or the meaning that they make from it, how they express their distress, how they communicate that to others, and how they heal. So how do they heal? What does help-seeking look like? And what does healing look like? And what does just compensation or fairness look like? So those are the three categories. Meaning and attribution, expressions of distress, and healing. Let me catch up with myself. So in thinking about the answers to those three categories of things, I have 4 concepts that I think if we can understand our own worldview, our own communication style, socio-political history, and ways of healing, we can be a lot better in our work with people whose worldviews and communication styles are different than our own. Worldview is the way that we understand and make meaning of the world. These are culturally bound ways of thinking and knowing, and they're deeply embedded. They're so deeply embedded that until we're confronted with something that challenges them, we don't even know that they're there. So this is always stuff that's in the background for all of us. And for most of us, I don't know where you all are from, but for myself as a Midwesterner, new to New York, but most of us in the United States, I think, come from a very individualist perspective. The unit of analysis for almost anything is at the individual level. And that is really, and I've seen it because I've stumbled, like the rude American, stumbled into it in ways that I've just been aware of how embedded that is in me, despite my best attempts to be culturally competent. So this is, I teach for a living, and I teach in 3-hour chunks, so this is about a 3-hour lecture right here, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but these are just some of the things related to worldview that I think are important to think about, and I'll just highlight a couple. I can't emphasize enough the difference between an individualist perspective in which what we think about first is ourselves and our own needs. And we even have sayings like, put your own oxygen mask on first before you help other people. And we've translated that to working with clients. And for people who come from a system in which that is not the priority is what is expected of me, what is my role in my family, and the idea of putting your own oxygen mask on first becomes a very selfish, foreign, silly idea. The other one that I've struggled to work with is the idea of locus of control. A lot of our Western approaches to psychotherapy are around helping people reestablish an internal locus of control, the ability, and disasters and tragedies are almost by definition disempowering. You lost control over something for some period of time, and helping people get that sense of control back. But if you're from a context in which your belief structure is such that you aren't in control of your own life or your own destiny, then what we've been taught how to intervene as clinicians doesn't really fit well. I do a lot of work with refugees from Burma, and truly some of the most clinically complex cases I've ever worked with, which I could teach a whole lesson based around the client that I'm thinking of right now, but just imagine if something bad can happen. It has happened to this woman, and she's only 23, 24 at this point in her life. And her belief is that it's her fate. It's her karmic destiny in this life to have experienced these things. And so I didn't, even all the way through my Ph.D. in psychology, nobody taught me what to do with that. And so those are really places where there's a mismatch between what I was at least trained to do and what my client needed from me in that moment. The other one is, the second concept I want to talk about is communication. How do people express their distress? And this is in Botswana where I was, so this is a khotla, which is the way that a community comes together to make decisions, which is very different from how we do. But the idea that I wanted to highlight here is around high context and low context communication. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea, but we, again, I'm going to do this sort of global thing, but I'm talking about myself. We as Americans are very low context in our communication, meaning what we say is what we mean. So the messages that we communicate are through words. And there are a lot of cultures, and this tends to be related to collective cultures, where you don't say it with the words. You say it with the context, the shared understanding, the body language, what you don't say. And so relying on a client and an exchange with a client that they're going to tell you with words what's happening to them creates a real gap or a real mismatch. And then this relates to the idea of somatization, which I'll tell you a story about in a second. This quote is from Laura Brown, who does this work. the ways in which humans translate their inner biological states of post-traumatic disequilibrium into outward expressions of distress are strongly affected by culture and context. So I think building on the talk we just heard, at the brain level, we all have the same reactions. Trauma impacts our brains the same way. But how people express that out loud or not out loud, how they communicate that to other people is very culturally bound. And if we expect people to be able to do that verbally when they're not from a cultural context such as ours, we may miss a whole lot of opportunity to do some good work. The same lady, this is her quote. So when you come from a different worldview or a different perspective on making meaning out of what's happening to you, our medical models or our biopsychosocial models even don't necessarily make sense in that context. So potential mismatches here that can create divisions instead of connections are around relying on the words being said, on emphasizing verbal expression, self-disclosure, interpersonal feedback. Those are all very Western-bound concepts about how healing can take place. And even in groups, which I'm a big group person, I'm a strong believer in groups, and I think groups make a lot of sense in collective cultures, but even there, we ask people to do things in the group, like self-disclosure and interpersonal feedback, which are still very individualist ideas. Issues of authority and directedness, a lot of times in cultures that are more hierarchical, they'll look to you as the expert and they just want you to tell them what to do. I'm not arguing that's the right thing to do, but they're going to be looking to you for much more direction than a lot of us are trained to offer. And then the idea of working toward individual goals. Going back to the individual versus collective thing, individual goals don't make a lot of sense to people whose unit of thinking about themselves and whose unit of identity is the group or the collective, not the individual. I want to tell you a quick story about this. So I mentioned I was working at the hospital in Bhutan. It's the national hospital. There are 8 psychiatric beds, and there are 8 substance abuse beds for the whole country. And me, this Westerner, has no idea what I'm doing. I mean, I know how to do some stuff, but not in that culture. And I work with a woman, and she comes in, and she's been all the way through the rest of the hospital. She can't see. And she's had every test that they could possibly offer, and they can't find anything wrong with her sight. So they've decided, and they being the medical doctors, and I believed it as well, that it was a true conversion disorder, the first one I'd ever seen as a clinician. And she goes on to tell me the story. She's the wife of a police officer, and she watched her police officer husband physically beat her teenage son to the point that he's mentally disabled. So she tells me this story, and in my very low context, blunt American way, I say, I wonder if there might be a connection between what you saw happen to you and the fact that you can't see now. Absolutely not. That was like the stupidest, even my interpreter looked at me like, what are you wanting me to ask this lady? And so but think about even just the metaphor there, right? Of I watched this terrible thing happen, and now I can't see, but I cannot articulate, consciously or unconsciously, that happened to me. But the power that woman had to, because it manifests, and this is just my own hypothesis about what was happening, but because it manifested itself in a way that was not an emotional problem, she was able to elicit help, even from her husband, in a way that if she had said out loud, I'm struggling, I have post-traumatic symptoms from watching you beat our son, she would not have been able to get that kind of help. And so for me, this was really a turning point, learning moment around the different ways in which people can express their distress in ways that in that setting it made sense for her. She did get the help that she needed, but not by saying, I'm sad and I'm traumatized because this terrible thing happened to me. Sociopolitical history and climate. There's a lot here, but when we're working in a community and a tragedy happens, that it's the response to the tragedy is going to be a microcosm of what was there before. Somebody just said this earlier. where you were right before the tragedy happened is where you start right after the tragedy happened. And that's true at a macro level as well. And so divisions that were there, and injustices and social issues of privilege and oppression are only heightened if we're not careful. Well, they are heightened, and then it's how we deal with that afterwards. When you're working with people who are refugees, are you raising your hand? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I just want to say, you know, I couldn't wait until cross-cultural psychology came into play, you know, because how do y'all deal with this with, you know, 9/11 responders or students, okay, that experienced, you know, trauma due to 9/11 or any other, you know, ethnic or cultural psychology? Because in ESL4, they don't concentrate on the spiritual aspect of it. And when you deal with cultural and ethnic psychology, I graduated in that same, you know, degree that, you know, how do you take in the cultural and ethnic aspect of their life because of, you know, with 9/11, because it goes beyond 9/11. It goes even.
Absolutely, absolutely it does. And so it's the starting point is not when the trauma happened. The starting point is the lens through which you were experiencing the world before the trauma happened. And so going back and, you know, as a white lady from the Midwest, I'm not going to be able to identify that experience, but just like with any other thing, I'm going to listen to that and validate how that person's experience influenced. It was the lens through which they saw the trauma, and we all are seeing the trauma through a different lens. I'm probably not doing justice to your question. I'm happy to talk to you more afterwards if you'd like to. A couple points I want to make here. The core, I have the reference upstairs in my bag if anybody wants. But as PTSD increases after a tragedy like this, xenophobic reactions increase. And I just think that's such a powerful statement about the need to think this way and to think cross-culturally about what we're doing. Because like I said at the beginning, as people, it makes sense, but as people sort of become self-protective and we're not operating out of the neocortex, we're operating out of this more primal piece of ourselves, and fear starts to set in. We start doing things that we might not otherwise, and thinking in ways we might not otherwise be inclined to do. And then, this is where I was at. Issues of refugees and immigrants from post-colonial countries. We have screwed up this idea of going into other countries, here comes the Americans who know what to do and how to do it, and not checking our assumptions out the door. And I watched that happen in Botswana, where Harvard had a big building, and UPenn had a big building, and Baylor had a big building, and they're all doing all these medical things. And my Botswana colleagues there from Botswana said, but nobody stopped to ask us what was happening. And so now in and those are post-colonial settings in which they're super heightened to Americans or white people or imperialists of any sort coming in and telling them anything. And so understanding that sort of post-colonial history, if you're working with people from a post-colonial country or a refugee whose fear of authority and their distrust of anyone is so heightened, those are just super important things to keep in mind as well. And then the final one is how and from whom is help for personal and social problems sought. And this is super important. Americans, Freud, whoever, I guess Freud wasn't an American, but didn't invent this idea of help seeking. And so instead of going in with our own ideas about what might be helpful or our own prescriptions, instead of leading the comet, we follow. We're at the back, we should be at the tail of the comet. What's helpful to you? How does your community typically deal with things like this? Who would you go to in another situation? What's been helpful to you before? The last thing we want to do if we're trying to build connections and reestablish a sense of community or collective efficacy is undermine the natural help-seeking and the natural support systems that are already there. We want to figure out what those are, listen to the clients, and build those up and support them instead. So this is just my conclusion. Considering issues of diversity can help repair collective efficacy and restore and strengthen social connectedness. If we're aware of our own culture and check our cultural assumptions and ask questions as we approach this work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you were told earlier, my name is Dan Stebbins. I was a colonel with the state police and boots on the ground commander in Newtown. Worst day of my life, worst nightmare I could ever imagine. I'm going to go through some real quick slides because part of what I'm doing today is encouraging you. I assume we have mostly therapists here?
It's mixed.
Families, fire,
survivors,
police, okay, great.
clinicians.
I apologize for not being here earlier today, otherwise I would have learned even more because I got great stuff from a lot of people today, so thank you. Who's got the button?
You do. It's up there.
Right there.
Okay. Who's got the button?
Get your fresh water, too.
All right.
Give me a collection here.
All of this I'm sure you've seen, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. This is going to be a Reader's Digest through the event. Obviously, the evacuation occurred, which I teach a class, by the way, on this event, which is 3 hours long, so you're here for the duration. No. We will get through some basic stuff. This is a memory reminder because I want you to see, because I believe, Doc, tell me if I'm wrong, most of our trauma memories are visual? A lot. Okay. I'm a second generation. I was glad to hear it today. I'm a second generation post-traumatic stress victim. My dad, at the age of 17, prior to his 18th birthday, was part of the cleanup crew in Hiroshima. And I thought my case was terrible. And real quick note on that, have you ever heard about the shadows? The shadows. He didn't tell me about that because he was old school. Don't talk about it. Don't ever talk about your experience until he was 65 as to what the shadows were. And that's how we treated people back in the day. Don't talk about it. Today we talk about things. Okay, this one slide I want to share with everybody in the room because these two little ones got to the tree line. I've seen so many school plans throughout the country that forbid this. Everyone that ran for their lives lived. We in the U.S. need to change our plans because they aren't working, and we have far too many cases to show that they don't work, whether it be the restaurant, the church, the school, the many different places we've had these active shooter mass murders. Okay, there's nothing wrong with evacuating your place. I don't like hide and hope. I'm going to tell you that right up front. So if you hear me saying, I don't like this hide and hope thing where we all hide under the tables, chairs, most of us are that era where that's what we were trained. Well, it was never tested, and it's a good thing because it didn't work. We're still teaching it. All the classic things happened here. We had way too much traffic. People couldn't get in there. We had parents and children and SWAT teams mixed together. It never happens like it does in the movies where they're all separate doing their own thing. Every one of these gentlemen and ladies that came went there with a purpose, save some lives, catch a bad guy, arrest somebody, maybe take the bad guy out. Nothing we went there for ever happened. Everything went wrong. This was very common right up front. Someone alluded to it earlier. We ended up putting a trooper with every one of the families who lost a loved one. This is a terrible thing to ever have to do, is to start separating the masses. All of these people get their children back and these people here don't. So you can just see how the stress was moving up on the level to where we, myself included, reached our tipping point. You can see it in these pictures. And I apologize for anybody that was there who this is bringing back bad things for. I've been down this road so many times that I've learned what works and doesn't work, at least for me. But think about it. You have a small town. Your police, your fire, your EMS have all been exposed to this. I'm only talking first responders today. We are the secondary people. Who are the true first responders? Those are the people in the school because they've got the first 4 minutes all on their own. We get it after that. So the true first responders for all these little ones were their teachers and the people associated with the school. I'm only going to talk about the normal definition of emergency responders, first responders, police, fire, and EMS. We didn't get to save anybody that day. And you're right, there was 28 people that died that day, but it's the 20 and 6 that were the biggest heartache. This is the front of the school. He shot his way in. What does that do to all school plans? Throws them out the window. They're all doing certain things, but they never planned on this. Why did he do that? He learned it from somebody else. They all read the papers. No offense on the papers. No offense on the media. I'm sharing it today with a lot of people here. I used to be the public information officer for the Connecticut State Police. 2.5 years, the best part of my career and the worst part of my career. It's great to know everything that's going on. It's terrible to know everything that's going on some days. All depends on what it is. So we had our day there with the media that ended up being 2 weeks and a real exercise in trying my patience. Okay. We did something at that case that a lot of people don't realize. We, police, fire, EMS, put our resources together and we performed the morgue function. We didn't just store the bodies, we processed them all. I say that to you because you need to get into the mindset of what I was left with when this was over. I had people that had to take all the photos, undress, prepare the clothes, prepare the bodies for shipping, 1 ME on scene. We had to do all the work to make the identifications. And for my law enforcement table, we don't normally do that stuff, not even close. But in this case, we did. This is the portable hospital that was set up. They work very well. They're extremely functional. Okay, I'm going the wrong way here. This is how it was set up in the parking lot. Is there a laser on this? That's the shooter's car. We'll be talking about that real briefly. Matter of fact, we probably won't talk about it. I'm going to tell you why that car's there real quick. Again, when you first think about it, you're thinking about parents of all first graders. We had teachers. We had staff. We had split families. Mom's family, father's family. I put a trooper with every one of those children. I ended up with 44 assignments because if I was going to take care of the families were a lot bigger than what I was thinking that day. You know, you can only handle so much. So we ended up with a lot of people committed to this. When you talk about the first responders who were in the classroom, when you talk about the first responders who were in the tent processing the bodies, when you talk about the family liaison officers, these troopers that were assigned to the families, they spent pretty much every waking hour with those families for the first 8 days. And they went through everything with them. What did I do to my list of people who are suffering post-traumatic stress? I bumped it up 44 people because they were with the families. They drove them to church. They took them to all the wakes. They took them to all the funerals. They went shopping with them. They fed their animals at the farms because there's some beautiful properties there. They did everything for those families. Why? All the things we went there to do, we didn't do any of them. Is that a stress on you as an individual? Absolutely. Everything we were going to do, everything we hoped to do, didn't happen. And so many things failed along the way that the people who were the first responders didn't have a high opinion of how our system works. Our 911 system failed. Our school plans failed. All the safety plans and drills, the SWAT team guys coming in, whether they're doing this pattern or that pattern, all those things, we didn't use any of them. So that's very frustrating to you if you are trained to do all of these things, and nothing worked that day. Okay, family liaison officer, yes, I initiated it, yes, I made that assignment. Yes, I took grief for it right up front. 2 of my majors said, hey, boss, that's not in the book. What are you doing? And I told them, I don't have time to tell you, but I want a trooper here for every one of those families. And they gave me a little more grief, which I respect because that's why you have people working for you. They question you if they think you're doing something that maybe we don't normally do. And I walked over to 2 local officers and said, can you work for me for the next week? I'll clear it with your boss. And they both said, yes, sir. And then my guys got the message. I had a lot of troopers showing up after that. But the reason I say that is it's, again, you have to get out of the box sometimes, get out of the mold, and do things differently because you've got something different on your plate. That's probably one of the best things we did. And I have to tell you, I stole it from the airlines. What's the name? And if you've heard me speak before, that's cheating. But what's the name of the airline? Took the nosedive down in the Everglades in Florida. Nope. Okay, even if you know, tell me now. Nobody knows. You know what? Normally they don't. Nobody wants to be that airline. ValueJet. Gone, off the map. Everything was gone with them. Nobody in business wants to be ValueJet. So after that, they created a system. When a plane goes down and crashes, all the airlines chipped in and did this. They put all the victims' families up in a hotel. They assign a family liaison person to the family, no matter what language they speak, no matter what country they're from, because they don't want to be ValueJet. They took a beating on that one. So anyways, the same thing that happens in law enforcement and emergency responder work. Pennsylvania State Police, nickel mines shooting at the Amish school. They will never be liked there. I don't say they all hate them, but they spent a lot of time with the media. They spent a lot of time doing other things. The colonel, who's a good friend of mine, spent a lot of time doing the media. He wasn't the PIO, but he took on that case because it was such a high case. Who got left out? Who didn't they spend a lot of time with? Families. Families. Who needs you the most? Families. So we've learned a lot. So that's why we put in the family liaison program. There were people that tried to get to these homes by the front door, by the back door, calling them on the phone all the time. For, as you said earlier, for that quote, for that clip, etc. What did they want to do? They wanted to be left alone. For all of you that are in the business, it's bad enough to have Newtown. It's bad enough to have all of these other sidebars. The media thing, I mean, they all got to do their job, I get that. But when a certain company in New York started sending tour buses driving by the scene, that got under my skin a little bit. And I told them they send them one more back, they won't get them back, meaning they wouldn't get their buses. But I was up by the school, and here goes a bus, a tour bus. It doesn't go anywhere, that road. And then about an hour later, another one went by. Time out. Time out. All right, that stopped. Some people you can't stop when they drive up. So you got to make accommodations, but the tour bus was a little over the top. I'm showing you all this stuff real quick because the stress level for our people was to the point where I thought I was going to lose people. I don't mean just they're not going to come back to work. They're not going to come back the next day anywhere because that's how depressed, that's how much suffering was going amongst all of us. And again, I put my hand in that group. We had it all around us. Memorials. Everybody loves memorials. I get that. But if the memorial brings you back to a post-traumatic stress situation, it's your spot on the floor. These aren't good for some people. They're great for most because we're honoring those that have passed usually. But they can be very harmful for the PTS people because it takes you from whatever you're in and puts you where you don't want to be. You go back there right away. And it's been the same thing with war, et cetera. It's the same thing with my dad. So I can speak to that. The people came from all over the country, all over the world to this. So we had reporters showing up 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes. It was all well-intended. It was great stuff. But it's hard for the people, like you saw in the background, to have a steady diet of that for days. So this is where you come in. All of this is hard on a family. All of this is hard on the emergency responders. When I started looking for help, this one is a great one. That's just what we were dealing with. Picture's worth 1,000 words. That's it for the slides. I wanted to refresh your mind on what occurred on that day and what we learned from it in just your category is what I want to share today. Most people think that we, as first responders, are trained to handle this stuff. You know, we went to an academy, we did this, we did that, and we hear a lot, and these guys in the side here can back me up on this. You know, people come up to me and say, how do you do this stuff? And other things will, you know, they'll come up with, I couldn't do that or something like that. And what do we say to them? Nah, you get used to it. Or we'll lie to them and tell them that we're trained to compartmentalize this stuff so it doesn't bother us. And basically we just lie to you. We hurt, we feel, we cry, just like anybody else. But we can't do it on your scene, at your location, because you will then think, wow, this guy can't handle this job. You know, he can't do this. But when we go home and We have our meltdown. We revisit the day. I can't tell you how scared my wife was at 4 o'clock in the morning the next day when I finally got home, for all of 2 hours before I went back to work. I came unglued, and I felt like, wow, where did this come from? Where did this come from? A complete crying breakdown where you can still hear the stress in me. The PTS is still there. It's a badge I will wear for the rest of my life. But I'm up here telling you about it, and that's the best part of this whole thing. I couldn't read the papers about this case. I couldn't do a lot of things. We went on for over 3 months with what I would call very little help for the first responders. I was doing a presentation to a little under 1,000 people, International Chiefs of Police Association down in New Orleans, going through some of the lessons we learned because of all the other failures. People need to know that 911 doesn't always work. People need to know that school plans don't work. So that was my gig. I did 3 hours down there. At the end of it, a young, good-looking chief walks up to me, and he says to me, hi, I'm Chief so-and-so. I said, nice to meet you. He says, can I talk to you? I says, I'm heading upstairs. You want to ride in the elevator? Go ahead. So he got on the elevator. On the way up, he says, I can see in you and hear in you exactly where he was and how he felt at his shooting. Aurora, Colorado, shooting in the theater. He said, I was a mess. He said, I was hurting all the time. And then he said, but then somebody came to me and taught me and treated me with EMDR. He took his business card out, wrote on the back of it EMDR, and gave it to me. And I had a little experience with EMDR before that. Right after Newtown, somebody gave me a business card that had EMDR written on it. EMDR. And this is just one of the modules? No, not module. Modalities. I learned something today. One of the modalities to treat post-traumatic stress. Well, when I originally got the card, shortly after Newtown, I can't tell you who gave me the card. I don't remember. Let's just say those were pretty trying days. And I took the card, but I keep all cards. I always stuff them in my shirt. I have them for years and years, and they go into those little plastic folders because you never know. I still have them. 40 years of this business. My wife thinks I'm nuts. But anyways, I went home, and I started flipping through it, and there it is, Karen Alter Reed, blah, 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 EMDR. And I says, EMDR. I thought the R was reprogramming. And I figured that's a bunch of hooey because you can't reprogram a brain. Reprocessing. Here's EMDR again. Long story short, Karen drives to my house an hour away from where she lives, at my home, in my living room, my wife making tea in the next room, because I had tried and tried and tried to get my people to go to treatment. Guess how many went? There was 50 people in the room one day, and I basically said to them, I know there's a lot of good stuff out there. I need you to do this because we're really hurting. This is a couple months into this. And of those 50, how many do you think went first? You got it. 0. 50. Their boss is telling them, go. Why don't they go? When we applied for their job as police, fire, EMS, and I'm sure it's in the medical field too, there's that piece. Have you ever been treated for a mental illness? How many people put down yes? Not me. I want the job. Why am I going to give them a reason to throw me out? If you do request services, HR gets involved. We all love HR because they keep all our personal records for when you want to get promoted or move up, so somebody's going to see those. So absolutely nobody went. They wouldn't give their names, and yet I had real problems. I had wives, spouses, significant others calling up through headquarters. You got to do something with this sergeant, this lieutenant, this trooper. People from within the agency calling up and saying, I'm really worried about these people because it really started to show 3 or 4 weeks. I think we all kind of felt, well, this is going to go away. It didn't go away. You know, here we are months later, and I've got real problems with my people. Not showing up for work, not getting their work done, people who are high activity people, you know, their spirits are up, they're always out there writing tickets, making money for the state. They're doing all that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden they're down, they're way down. And hey, guess what? We found so-and-so, he's sleeping in the cemetery. in his cruiser, not working on a day off, but that's where he had been sleeping, in a cemetery, near a stone from Newtown. You know, it was one of my FLOs, family liaison officer. You know, we get real tight with these people, with our families. So anyways, we had a lot of work to do, and we weren't doing it well because, first of all, I didn't know who to call. I'm in charge of a 1,000-man department. I have a whole circle of colonels from around the country that's our club. We all share with stuff with each other. None of them offered it up to me. I had my research and planning staff look it up. Basically, look up family liaison officer first. Not one agency in the country was doing it at the time. We did find something written on it out of the UK, but nobody had a policy for family liaison officers. I says, okay, well, what are they doing for post-traumatic stress? And then I called other people in the business, and they said, well, you're hard to get to, basically because of our own forms. People don't come to us, so we don't get to see too many fire, police, EMS. There's a piece of that I'm missing, but most of us, and I'll speak for myself, I'm not going to come out and say to you, almost 5 years ago, that I've been treated for post-traumatic stress for a mental illness. I would not say that to you. I surely wouldn't write it down on a piece of paper. I don't call it post-traumatic stress syndrome or anything else. I just drop it as the post-traumatic stress. The reason I say that is I think it can be healed. I think it's an injury. It's a post-traumatic stress injury to the brain that can be fixed by going through what you've been talking about since I got here today. So now, after the setting in my living room with Karen, I went through my horrific walk. My horrific walk, translated, means walking through every one of those classrooms. Then I went through my identification walk. I had a gentleman who wouldn't go home at midnight. He was still there hoping his daughter was alive. She was a teacher. And we did have a couple of school staff that hid in a closet for over 3-4 hours. And they were finally found. And he knew that story, so he thought maybe his daughter was still somewhere. Well, his daughter was Victoria Soto. She was one of the heroes up there. But I took a walk up, and this was not Colonel, this was Dan to this gentleman, because he's a DOT worker who I happen to know. You know, we've both been on the highway together at different scenes. So I walked through, and I found Victoria, which I knew she was there, but I'd never met her. And in that school, they wear these, but they're big 5x7s, different colored yarns around them, very nicely done. And all the kids are trained. If they don't have one of those tags on, they're a stranger, tell the teacher. So I knew that they would have them. They had a great security program at that school for the times. It met all the accreditation standards, et cetera, which we in society need to change. But anyways, I now believe in, after those horrific walk, identification walk, and then the third walk was a detail walk. You can't take all that information in one walk through. Can't do it. The evidence. What happened here? Where did he go first? Where did he go second? How did all those bullets get way down that hallway? You know, all of these questions that you were thinking, well, now I walk through the detail walk. I did all of those things with Karen. I hadn't done them with anybody because I didn't want to go there. As you described, the chest would start hurting, the eyes would start welling up. Even thinking about talking about this to somebody was terrible for me until I watched the hand back and forth with Karen. And to be honest with you, even when she sat down, I think the world of her today. At the time, and this is a bunch of hooey, you're going to reprogram my brain. Not happening. Well, we go through this, and I don't even think she was listening. And then I find out later on, they really don't have to listen to what you're saying. They have to connect. They have to make sure you're doing the right thing. They have to make sure your brain is reprocessing. And you hit it right on the head when you said that. You know, you've got to be, your connection has to be with the person, not with what they're saying, because it rubs off. If I told you my horrific story, I can guarantee you I would have people crying in the room. And when I do my presentation, I get everybody to laugh, but there's also a Kleenex box on each table, because for them to remember the lessons that need to be learned, You got to walk them through certain doors. You can't just talk about it. You have to hit them here. And that's what I do in my full presentation. What I'm hoping comes from today is we don't have to have those kind of presentations because those people won't be suffering for so long. You can get out there early on. Now, you can understand the people in those pictures. You can understand me. You can understand anybody that was in the school that they suffered post-traumatic stress. How about the people who processed the film from the cameras? Do you think they were affected by this? Never on scene, many, many miles away. How about the people who had to listen to and transcribe the audio tapes? Photos, videos, audio tapes, even reviewing the file to see what can be released to the media. That means they had to read everything. They had to redact everything. So my group of what I thought was going to be 50, I guaranteed them 50 to the treatment people that came to me and said, I said, look, I can't get people to go. You're going to have to say, I don't want any names, and I don't want to get paid, and I'm not going to go through human relations at work. So they could all be done anonymously. And then I says, if you do that, I'll guarantee you 50 people. And they said, absolutely, we'll do it. And I said, wow. Why? Because of the modalities. They wanted to test one against the other. You didn't comment on it, Doc, and I appreciate that. And I won't either, because I only know one. The others could work better for all I know. But I know that the one that they watched the hand worked for me, and it worked very well. You'll still see pieces of it, because one of the things that I don't think is real clear, it wasn't clear to me, is all the flashbacks that I still have. Sometimes I don't know that I'm going to flash back because I haven't had that memory. You know, you'll all of a sudden see, I call it the Kodak slide carousel in my head. It's got all those slides in there. Well, every now and then, I haven't seen one of those, and all of a sudden it hits, and it really brings things home. I went to the reopening of the school, the new school when they opened it, and that was the first time I'd been back to the scene since that couple of weeks. 3.5 years at the time. Oh, it was 4 before the school opened, right?
3.5.
Yeah, 3.5. So I went back to the school opening. Just driving up the street and turning in that driveway, I said, oh, no, this is not going to work. But it did. It did. You know, I had brought my wife and my daughter with me, and they know, you know, that this is a tough road. But I want to say to you, thank you for what you're doing, especially the treatment people. This is a classic example of someone who has post-traumatic stress that you won't know what's going on, but if you don't know the person. A week after Newtown, Friday night, was the first time in that week that I was going to be out of uniform. I had to go to my daughter's Christmas recital. Normally, those aren't real high on my list, but it was going to be the first time I was out of uniform in a long time and not dealing with the weight of Newtown on my shoulders all day. So I was excited. I get to the school. My wife's on the phone. Hurry up, they've already closed the curtain, you know, across the stage. You're going to be late. We're in the front row, blah, blah, blah. All you wives, I appreciate you most of the time. And she said, come on. I said, all right. So I literally go running up to the back of the auditorium. I get down the hallway, walk down to the front row, and there they are. And here's my wife, my mother-in-law, and the empty seat for me to sit in. I can't tell you how good it felt to just sit there. Thank you. I'm here on time. I won't have to listen to that, so that's good. And I get to just be a dad for a few minutes. The curtain opens up, and it's the first grade kids all sitting on the bleachers singing a song, all in their red and white clothes, all dressed for Christmas, which was the same event a week earlier, basically the same dress code. And I've been in this business a long time. I keep myself in good shape, mentally and physically. Guess what? So, sometimes you just don't know what just happened, but if you lived it, you'll pick it up every time. You'll pick it up every time. So for me, I have a few other points I would like to get through real quickly, some do's and don'ts that I've seen for mistakes. If someone asks you, this was a big one. I had a lot of these people that were in trouble. By the way, I went back to them and made a plea to all my people for the 50, because they want to test the modalities. 3 years later, I asked Karen, so how'd my 50 make out? I absolutely stayed out of it. I didn't want to know because I wasn't supposed to know who went, who didn't go, what their problems were. And she laughed at me. Karen's pretty professional. She's pretty straight. She's laughing at me. I says, what are you laughing at? She goes, your 50 turned into 300. 300, all voluntary. Please help me. That's why I talked about those other groups. It's not just the on-scene people. It's the investigators who are there after. I can tell you my major crime squad who processed the scene inside the school, within a year, 60% of them left. My second major crime squad who worked in the tent, within a year, 80% of them left. They were never even in the school, but they processed all the bodies. After 3 years, I had the third major crime squad there also. They did the house where just the mother was killed. Those guys were all still there. Why? We did one-person suicides, homicides all the time. That didn't reach our tipping point. You know, these guys do that all the time. But you add death to any scene, you add children to any scene, and we all get closer to our tipping points. I can tell you, Doc, I can be a witness for you also. After I finished my 3 walkthroughs with Karen, I was elated. I was so impressed. I couldn't believe how much weight had been lifted off my chest. At least that's what it felt like. I then said to her, hey, does this work on old stuff? She goes, what do you mean old stuff? I says, I have a 25-year-old case that I don't even like thinking about, never mind talking about, and a 30-year-old case that I don't like thinking about or talking about. And she goes, I don't know. Let's try it. I watched the hand for a little while longer. The next morning I went to work, pulled my chief of staff in and my secretary, I sat them down, I told them 2 stories, and they both looked at me and go, wow, why are you telling us this? I says, because for 25 and 30 years I've never been able to tell these stories because I get all choked up, so it works. Works very well. Okay, do not take all your people offline. Pennsylvania, the ones that were really suffering post-traumatic stress, they took them offline and told them to go home. They were afraid. We had fire, police, and EMS in Newtown stand down. So they were not answering calls for a few days. Pennsylvania State Police did the same thing. Don't put them in a closet when they have all those things in their head. Don't make them go home and sit by themselves. Pennsylvania told us we should have never done that. We had more problems with the ones that went home rather than the ones that were simply reassigned. Give them something else, but bring them back to their friends. Bring them back to their normal routine. Bring them back into the fold. Don't send them home. So we didn't send anybody home because then you will have people who never come back to work. And that's a loss for you, your company, et cetera. So I would say that that's a big one for everybody. I have a lot of stuff. I know we're really short on time, but why won't people from first responders go for treatment? I think that's a big lesson to learn. Not sending them home is a big lesson to learn. Definitely supporting the fact that they need help and it's understandable and they will be better. If for no other reason, do it for their families, do it for themselves. Don't do it for the company. They put you in that role, but you also signed on. I think with that, I'm going to say thank you for the opportunity to be here for a few minutes. This is, in my mind, come a long ways in almost 5 years, the recognition of what is going on here. I get calls from all over the country. 35 years with the state police. I took a break for 5.5 years in there, and I worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office. While I was working for the U.S. Attorney's Office, I got to know the other 93 offices, which are all over around the country. They heard that I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, went back to the state police, because when Governor Malloy came in, I went back to the state police. They knew, obviously, my role in Newtown. I get calls from those offices around the country because they've invited me to speak to them and give them the whole 3 hours. They're looking for you. They have military people who are going to court because of something they did, but they're only charged with a crime. Nobody's ever looked at what was going on in their head. And a lot of them are suffering post-traumatic stress. And yet, things happen when you have post-traumatic stress that you wouldn't normally do. I mean, you don't go to a little dance recital and sit there and cry your eyes out and have to leave. That's not my norm. So I know it causes you to be out of your norm. So I've been getting calls now for quite a while, Canada and the United States, who in our area does what you do? You know, who are the therapists? And poor Karen, I call Karen, she gives me 2 or 3 names. Thank you very much.